Yes.
Still in June 1983, sir, Dr. Walford prepared a questionnaire for fractionators requesting information on a number of matters. If we could have on screen, please, Shumik, DHSC 302229_041. You can see from the bottom right-hand corner that this is sent by Dr. Walford, and the date is the 14th of June 1983. At this stage, it is an internal DHSS document, but we know from other documents that this is the form of a questionnaire that was sent to the fractionators. It is easier to read on this version, which is why we're using it. The questions posed are from number 1, and we'll go through them in turn. 1. Does your company manufacture coagulation factor concentrates for use in the UK? If yes, name the product and state how much of each is supplied annually. 2. From which country or countries is the source plasma obtained? 3. If from the United States, is all plasma collected at FDA licensed plasma collection centres? Please give the names of the centres and their location. Question 4. If non-USA plasma is used, name the countries involved and state whether the plasma collection centres in these countries are licensed by the national regulatory authorities. 5. Are you able to identify the origin of the plasma included in each batch of final product and the date on which it was collected? 6. Is the plasma from each collection centre fractionated separately, or is plasma from several collection centres pooled prior to processing? 7. If the plasma is of US origin, are you able to supply final products which do not contain plasma from the major epidemic areas for AIDS, e.g. New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Miami? 8. Can you confirm that all plasma of US origin in your product is being collected in conformity with the FDA directive of the 23rd of March 1983? 9. Did your company institute, in advance of the FDA requirements, any special precautions to be taken by plasma collection centres in respect of AIDS? If so, what were those precautions and when were they introduced? 10. If USA plasma is used, are you able to confirm that all future supplies of coagulation factor concentrates to be sold in the UK will be manufactured from plasma collected in accordance with the FDA directives of the 23rd of March 1983, or in accordance with special precautions, if any, instituted by your company at an earlier date? The answer to 10 is no. From what date can you meet this requirement? So those were the questions posed by Dr. Walford and the DHSS. They were sent off to the principal fractionation companies and indeed some other companies as well. The inquiry has identified the direct responses of the UK subsidiaries of Miles Cutter and of Armour, and the references are at paragraph 139 of the written presentation. We know that the other companies replied as well, including Alpha, Highland and Immuno, and we know that because of a table that we've looked at before, but I will ask to bring up again. It's DHSC 302229_055. And if we could go to the second page of this document, just so that we orientate ourselves. This is the table that we looked at repeatedly in September and October, which provides in tabular form the responses of the 5 companies to the questions that have been posed by Dr. Walford. We can see the product name is included, UK annual sales. You asked about Armour earlier, sir. We can look the first row, but annual sales from Armour were in the region of 15 to 20 million international units of factor rate and 1 to 1.5 million units of high potency factor rate. If we could go back out again, please, Shumik, we can see that that is the largest single supply by any company. You may feel so, but there's a reasonable inference that among the 30% of overseas sales that were referred to in the previous document, some of those came to the UK. If we could turn back to the previous page, a helpful prose summary of the responses to the question given on this page by Mr. Wrigglesworth of the DHSS. And you can see at A, B, and C, there's a reference to various firms who were approached and who didn't supply blood products from human coagulants, including Spaywood there. The following firms are the suppliers of blood products in the UK, and that's Alpha, Armour, Travenol, Immuno, and Miles. And then, we quote from the document, Mr. Wrigglesworth says this: annual imports of factor 8 by the above firms total about 42 to 50 million units. With the exception of Immuno, the firms state they do not or have ceased to collect in epidemic areas. All state that their collection centres are FDA licensed. The plasma in each case is pooled prior to processing. In the case of Immuno products, European plasma and USA plasma are pooled separately. The origin of all plasma is identifiable. Each has given the assurance that future sales will comply with FDA guidelines. However, Miles Labs, that's for Cutter, state that factor 8 manufactured from plasma collected since March 1983 will not be available until August, and Immuno in September 1983. We can take that down now, thank you. The answers contributed to a debate within the United Kingdom about whether a ban should be placed on pre-March plasma, a matter that was discussed, among other places, at the Committee on the Safety of Medicines Biological Subcommittee on the 13th of July 1983. Has been explored elsewhere in the inquiry. The DHSS officials turned to the debate taking place in the United States in the anticipation that the British position would mirror that taken by the American authorities. The focus across the Atlantic, however, was moving away from questions about donor screening to the debate about what should be done about product recall. That debate posed existential questions of the US fractionator. We turn to that now. A meeting took place on... Sorry, actually, Schumacher, we could bring the document up first. CGRA 40267, please. This is a record made by Highland Travenol of a meeting that took place on the 9th of June 1983 between representatives of the Plasma Manufacturers Association and the FDA. The fractionation companies represented were Highland, represented by Richard Strigley, Cutter, Dr. Ajala was there for them, Alpha, Dr. Carr, and Armour, Dr. Riddell. It's notable that Dr. Riddell had moved to Armour by this time from Highland. Bill Weathersby was also there for Armour. The FDA attendees included Dr. Petriciani and Dr. Donahue. The CDC was not represented at the meeting. Paragraph 142 of the written presentation has the relevant references for that list. The meeting was held at the request of the FDA with the intention of developing a policy to respond to situations where a donor whose plasma had contributed to a fractionation pool was later found to have AIDS. I'm going to read now from the minute. Not the minute, but the note that was made by Highland. If we could go to the fourth paragraph down. First three paragraphs deal with who was attending. What is recorded is this. This meeting was an opportunity to discuss with the OB, that's the Bureau of Biologics, the concerns which manufacturers have in attempting to live with the potential that a donor whose plasma has been used in one or more pools over a period of time may later be found to have AIDS. The OB feels that there is a need to develop a policy to handle that eventuality, and that the policy should be developed in a public forum involving the CDC, National Haemophilia Foundation, and other interested parties. For their part, however, the policy must be one which does not interrupt the supply of coagulation products to haemophiliacs or cause a panic condition in the mind of users. Given the degree to which a relatively small number of donations can affect a large number of product lots, and the uncertain but long gestation period for the disease, developing a policy which is acceptable to the major interest groups is seen as a real challenge. That is reflecting the views of the FDA. We go over to the next page, please. From the top. After considerable discussion, two alternative points of view began to emerge. One, when a donor is found to have AIDS, his plasma is excluded from pools. If the manufacturer has followed donor screening guidelines, product need not be recalled. If donor records show signs of prior illness, and the manufacturer had continued to plasmapherese the donor, the manufacturer may be required to recall product. Left unanswered are questions related to the status of processed but undistributed product. One corollary to this plan, which was discussed, was the feasibility and legality of discontinuing the distribution of product under the company's control, but not recalling product which had already been sold. While this appeared to be workable from the point of view of the compliance people, it has obvious shortcomings. 2, pick a time period prior to diagnosis which the donor's plasma would be considered to be at risk and withhold from distribution or recall product manufactured from pools containing at-risk plasma. The difficulty pointed out with this plan was that unless a very short, perhaps indefensibly short, time period were chosen, the amount of product affected could be very large. So those are the two main ideas that are being floated at this meeting. The first can be summarized as an idea that if the manufacturer involved had followed the correct procedures, then there would be no need to recall previous plasma. The second was that if a time period were picked, then product that was produced during that time period would be recalled or would be withheld from distribution. Those are the two ideas that were being floated at the meeting.
Do we know any more about the basis for the suggestion that the following procedures, which are designed to ensure that high-risk donations are not accepted, is sufficient to deal with the problem when it appears that a high-risk donation has become very risky indeed and has been accepted.
The logic is that which is contained in this document.
That's all we've got?
Yes.
I see.
We will go on and we'll see in future documents a sense being expressed that there isn't a scientific rationale, if I may put it this way, for these proposals. It is an attempt to strike a balance between what was seen as the need for maintaining plasma supply and concerns about the safety of these products. So it is a pragmatic approach rather than a scientific approach, if I may put it that way. Fair to acknowledge that in this document, references are made to, and I quote, the obvious shortcomings of the plans and the difficulty that the time period proposal puts forward as well.
So at the bottom paragraph there, about 6 lines up from the bottom, is Dr. Petriciani, he's the FDA.
Yes.
Stated that the March 24 recommendations were interim. The OB would welcome comments from industry regarding the donor screening and examination provisions, including the double standard.
Yes, that is a reference to the fractionators' complaint that they are being held to a higher standard than the blood banks. The fractionators said, well, the blood banks should have exactly the same requirements made of them because the risk for whole blood is the same as for plasma. And that debate was aired at this meeting as well. And Dr. Petriciani is saying, well, we'll continue to listen to you on this issue, as it were. He also goes on to point out that nothing prevents manufacturers from imposing their own standards on top of those recommended by the BAB. And Penny Carr of Alpha said that Alpha had done just that and had lost several vendors of recovered plasma as a result. And that is the issue that I alluded to earlier, that plasma, when Alpha put in place its measures and insisted that other centres that it contracted with adhered to them, there was a breakdown in relations between Alpha and several of those centres. If we go on to the paragraph just below that, the note records this. After some time, it became apparent that no additional new issues remained to be discussed. The meeting adjourned with the following action taken. 1. The OB will be scheduling an open meeting in July to discuss blood product issues related to AIDS, including the need for product recall. 2. The manufacturers will meet prior to that to assemble information pertinent to the subject which would be of benefit to the OB in formulating policy. And that 3 examples are given, including what action is recommended by the manufacturers to deal with this problem, given that the OB feels that it will be forced to take some sort of position on the matter, which is scientifically defendable and at the same time politically responsive. That was the challenge set then for the fractionators, to try to come up with a policy that would meet those dual requirements. A little further information is provided on this meeting from a note that was made by Dr. Ajala of Qatar. And if we could have on screen, please, CGRA 40231. First page shows the notice 13th of June. Dr. Ajala and it's about the same meeting that we've just been discussing. If we could turn to page 2, please. The second and third paragraph, starting a series of meetings. Dr. Ajala recorded this. A series of meetings will be held in Europe to review the screening process in the United States, and Donoghue stated that his mission was to defend our current procedures. He asked assistance from the manufacturers to convince those overseas that we are doing an acceptable job of screening out any AIDS donors. I spoke with Donoghue and Patriciani privately about our Orlando donor. They agreed that based on the evidence that they saw, no need for any recall action. The donor was only drawn once, and Donoghue commented that his symptoms were common to active homosexuals, but not indicative of AIDS. So a discussion there, sir, between a representative of Qatar and representatives of the FDA about what to do in a specific example where a donor had been identified, presumably, as being somebody who may have symptoms that were associated with AIDS. The decision was not to recall the product. A further perspective on the meeting comes from a note that was provided by Alpha's representative, Dr. Peggy Carr. And could we have on screen, please, CGRA 40598. Page 2 of that document. Again, it's a summary of what was said, the same meeting still. And if we could highlight the third paragraph, beginning Dr. Patriciani stated. Dr. Patriciani stated quietly but firmly that he considered it essential that the manufacturers, in presenting their proposal, this is about product recall, discuss the feasibility of doing what we suggest and the potential availability of product. The message is loud and clear. He stated frequently that this is a social, economic, public relations and emotional issue, not a scientific one. Please note, we must be prepared by the middle of July with a rational example of what could happen in terms of a long-term donor whose plasma has been used in the manufacture of AHF and PTC, and what the economic consequences would be to us in terms of cost and, secondly, in terms of the availability of our products. Note that this should cover not only AHF and PTC, but all of the blood products manufactured. One issue discussed over and over again was the potential for this wiping out a manufacturer totally economically. Therefore, when you're talking about the availability of product, you must also address the potential loss of products from AHF manufacture. Dr. Carr there recording what she perceived and what was discussed as the threat to the industry from a policy of product recall that would undermine their economic position. By the time of that meeting in June, there were 1,508 identified cases of AIDS, according to the CDC in the United States, 575 deaths, and 15 people with haemophilia had been identified as having AIDS. The open meeting on this topic took place on the 19th of July, 1983, so about a month later. The forum was the Blood Products Advisory Committee, and it met at the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Patriciani introduced the topic and the difficulties involved. Dr. Everett provided an overview of the epidemiology of AIDS and stated that by that time, July, there were 17 cases in people with haemophilia that had been identified by the CDC. There was further discussion of the criteria for AIDS and on research on its etiology. If we could have, please, BAYP 304674. This is the formal summary minute of the meeting. If we could turn to page 2, please, which is where the record begins of a discussion on product recall, right at the bottom of the page, paragraph 6. The minute says this. Dr. Michael Riddell, representing the 4 member companies of the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, PMA, involved in the manufacturing of an anti-haemophilic factor. We go on to the next page, please. Thank you. Alpha Therapeutic Corporation, Armour Pharmaceutical Corporation, Miles Cutter's Laboratory, and Highland Therapeutics. Dr. Riddell outlined the donor education and screening programs initiated by each of the companies in early 1983 to reduce the number of donors from the high-risk groups. Approximately 4 to 4.5 million litres of source plasma are fractionated on an annual basis, which result in 800 million anti-haemophilic factor units. Primary plasma pool sizes range from 1,000 to 10,000 litres, with the result that a given pool could produce between 0.5 million to 5 million AHF units and treat an estimated 12 to 125 patients per year, or 500 to 5,000 individual treatments. Because the industry estimates that the average frequent plasma donor makes between 40 and 60 donations a year, a single donor could easily be represented in as many as 50 plasma pools in 1 year. Were this donor subsequently found to have AIDS and a decision made to recall all units collected in a time period of 1 year prior to that, 25 to 250 million AHF activity units could be affected, all in various stages of pooling, production and distribution. Given the BMA estimate of 800 million AHF activity units produced annually by the fractionation industry, the potential for serious disruption of AHF supply described by Dr. Riddell seems quite real. And I pause there, sir, to note that elsewhere in the literature, and indeed in, I believe in Mr. Justice Creever's report, the point is made that according to those figures given by Dr. Riddell, then 4 AIDS-positive donors could jeopardise the entire supply that these manufacturers made.
Yes, I think Creever puts it as the entire world supply was what was being said, which may represent the American view of their control of the worldwide market.
From a British perspective, sir, the imported products were overwhelmingly American at that time. There was a small amount imported from Immuno, but as we saw in Dr. Walford's evidence, attempts to source alternative supplies from Europe were unsuccessful at that time. There was no spare supply. So, at least in terms of Britain, there is a very heavy dependence upon the United States manufacturers for the product that was imported. If we go back to the document, we can see how the discussion developed after Dr. Riddell's contribution. Dr. Riddell has spelt out the problem, and Dr. Stephen Ajola from Miles Cutter puts forward what the industry thinks should be the solution. Dr. Stephen Ajola, Miles Cutter Laboratories, presented the PMA recommendation against automatic recall. Automatic recall could lead to serious product shortages. PMA recommends that manufacturers continue current screening and policies of discarding plasma from suspect donors. Dr. Ajala stated that recall decisions should be made following each company's policy in close consultation with the FDA and should be considered on a case-by-case basis in light of current knowledge of AIDS. One lot of final product has been voluntarily withdrawn from the market, and suspect units of plasma are routinely discarded by plasma derivative manufacturers. Dr. Louis Aladort presented the National Haemophilia Foundation recommendation that any product concentrate be recalled if it includes material from an individual that has later been identified as having AIDS, or from an individual that, in the best medical judgment of the manufacturer, has characteristics strongly suggestive of AIDS. He noted, however, that the NHF did not have access to the PMA data when the statement was formulated, and that there was great concern about the continued supply of AHF. We'll come back to Dr. Aladort's contribution in a second. The summary. It was very clear that, confronted with this complex problem, the committee felt that a balance must be struck between theoretical risk of the product to recipients against the need for an uninterrupted supply of a life-sustaining therapy. As several members of the panel stressed, it would be undesirable to distribute and use a lot of product which incorporated plasma from a donor with a definite diagnosis of AIDS. However, signs and symptoms suggestive of AIDS, e.g. persistent lymphadenopathy, night sweats, etc., would not be persuasive enough to dictate a recall of product. Enough concern was expressed about the question of supply that the committee was unwilling to advise the agency to take an unalterable regulatory position calling for an automatic recall, which would likely jeopardize product availability. We go over to the next page, please. Adding to the uncertainty with regard to the decision of whether to quarantine or recall a product lot, several committee members and other participants expressed the opinion that the risk of AIDS from transfusion of plasma derivatives or use of AHF concentrate has not been definitely established. They cited the fact that nearly all the haemophiliacs with AIDS had used material from different lots, and that many other haemophiliacs receiving these same lots had not developed AIDS. They stressed the need for studies to follow up recipients of blood products derived from AIDS patients. The consensus of the committee was that the action to be taken for each incident of inclusion of plasma from a donor who might have AIDS into a product pool should be decided on a case-by-case basis. That is the formal minute, sir, but we are also assisted by a note of the meeting taken by Dr. J.B. Derrick of the Canadian Red Cross, who was present. If we could have on screen, please, CBLA 5056, sorry, 60s, no, 5056 underscore 215. We could go to page 8. Sorry, I'll just note that this is, as we can see at the top, from Dr. Derrick, referring to the same meeting. And if we could go, please, to page 8, and at paragraph 15, please. The previous paragraphs have described what Dr. Riddell and Dr. Ajala said. The description there is consistent with the one that we've just read from a formal minute. Dr. Derrick says that there was then a panel discussion, and I read from his note. Panel discussion subsequent to these two presentations centred on present action with reference to hepatitis contamination of pools and or products, the possibility of reducing pool size, brackets, not considered a viable or well-based approach to the problem, the Highland recall of an Autoplex lot because of a suspicion of AIDS contamination. This gesture lost some of its significance when it turned out that they were speaking of 187 vials. A significant question, quotes, what is the risk associated with receiving blood from a donor later identified as an AIDS victim? Brackets, nobody knows. Moving on to the next paragraph. Dr. L. Aladort made a presentation on behalf of the NHF and its MSAC, Medical and Scientific Advisory Committee, in which it was requested that any lot of factor VIII concentrate should be recalled if it includes material from an individual either with AIDS or strongly suggestive of having AIDS. Dr. Aladort made this statement with some degree of embarrassment and actually disclaimed any personal responsibility for it. He stated that personally, he feels that the recall position for AIDS contamination should be similar to the current practice with reference to hepatitis B contamination, i.e. a similar position to that stated by Steve Ajala earlier. In an exchange on the floor, it became apparent that the current state of knowledge simply does not lend itself to such an uncompromising position. The subsequent panel discussion identified the following pertinent points. The manufacturers had demonstrated in their presentation that they have a full appreciation of the need to respond to the present situation in a responsible manner. B. 1. For haemophilia patients, the current AIDS attack rate is no more and is probably less than that of a year ago. B2. The need for the coagulation products would appear to far outweigh the difficulties with which would result from large-scale recall. Further, there is no guarantee that product lots in which no AIDS-positive donor has been identified are any less effective than products in which AIDS has been implicated. C. The present state of knowledge is simply not adequate enough for blanket decisions involving large-scale recall or the initiation of an hiatus on factor VIII concentrate production for an adjustment period, suggested 6 months, to allow for accumulation of plasma collected under more stringent conditions. D. While individual physician committee members might find it a difficult decision to treat their patients with material with which an AIDS donation had been implicated, there was nothing to be gained by recall in the face of the present state of knowledge. E. Drying up the supply of AHF would place haemophilia patients at greater risk to their health when continuing therapy under the present circumstances. The meeting concluded with the chairman's summary that while it was abhorrent to the committee to consider condoning the use of products from which there was a known risk of AIDS development in the recipient, there was an agreement on the part of the committee that mandatory recall is not presently warranted in view of the lack of data and information on the extent of risk and the potential for serious disruption of the supply of coagulation products. A couple of points to pick up from that. The chairman who was referred to at the end there was the acting chairman of BPAC, Dr. William Miller, not Dr. Bove, who we heard about earlier. The second point, we could just go back to point C on that page. this picks up on your question about what was done about pre-March plasma and what was not being done. Although the focus of the discussion on this meeting seems to have been about recall of products where a donor was known or suspected to have developed AIDS, there does seem to have been some discussion about what to do with products that were created and produced before the enhanced screening methods were put in place. According to this note, the view was taken by the meeting that there was simply not enough, the present state of knowledge is simply not adequate enough for blanket decisions about either the large-scale recall or a suggested hiatus period where one suspects there's a suspension of providing material for 6 months to allow enough stock to be produced from the screening methods, and then that would be distributed out. And that was a proposal which did not find favour at the meeting. We don't have any further detail from this document or from the previous document about what the reasoning behind that was, although given the general context of the discussion, it seems fair to say that the 2 points that were raised against such a proposal were firstly the lack of scientific knowledge about the condition of a risk, and secondly the need to maintain a plasma supply. Dr. Patriciani, it's Dr. Donoghue, who gives the FDA's impression of a meeting in a memorandum to Dr. Patriciani a few days later. If we could have that on screen, please. It's JREE 5019. It's electronic page 313. We can see that this is a memorandum that was dated the 21st of July 1983. What Dr. Donoghue wrote is this, and I quote, "My interpretation of the Advisory Committee review of the safety of Factor VIII and related to acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS, is as follows. The risk of transmitting AIDS to an individual haemophiliac from a specific lot of Factor VIII is very, very small if it exists. Therefore, disposition of Factor VIII from a pool which contains plasma collected from a donor who may have acquired immunodeficiency syndrome should be considered as a discrete incident. A conclusion as to the distribution or destruction of a final product should consider such variables as the degree of specificity of the diagnosis, the time of onset of symptoms in relation to the time of donation, the potential effect upon immediate supply of Factor VIII, and the long-term production of this essential plasma derivative. It is emphasized that all aspects of AIDS, including the cause, method of transmission, predisposing factors, and definition of the syndrome itself, are incompletely understood in spite of the extensive and intensive research activity focused upon these issues. The benefit from life-threatening or disabling hemorrhage far exceeds the risk of acquiring AIDS."
There must be something wrong with that. Benefit from life-threatening or disabling hemorrhage.
I think that is intended to mean the benefit of avoiding life-threatening or disabling hemorrhage by using the concentrates far exceeds the risk of acquiring AIDS. That was Dr. Donoghue's summation of the discussion and the consensus view at that meeting. In Britain, Dr. Fowler recorded his understanding of the meeting in a minute dated the 28th of July 1983. This is at DHSC 302231_063. Dr. Fowler wrote this. We spoke yesterday about the FDA meeting held on the 19th of July 1983 to discuss the implication of AIDS for blood products. The meeting was attended by Dr. Mayer and other senior members of the administration, with representatives of US and Canadian Red Cross, haemophilia organisations and the manufacturers. It lasted 4.5 hours. Although the subject got a very thorough airing, nothing new came to light. The possibility of banning all products made before the implementation of the March 83 regulations was discussed, but was rejected on a majority vote. The hiatus in supplies which such action would cause was the deciding factor. There is likely to be a congressional hearing on the same subject next Tuesday, and this is likely to be much more media-orientated. I have been promised a report and will let you have it as soon as possible. So that minutes are written in the knowledge and the context of the ongoing debate in Britain about what to do with the pre-March plasma. The source of the information may have been Dr. Duncan Thomas. We have seen that he was present at other meetings in 1983, and his name was included in the list of those attending the meeting that we have just been looking at. So it may be that he was feeding back to Dr. Fowler. The congressional hearing that Dr. Fowler referred to took place on the 1st and the 2nd of August 1983. It resulted in no change of approach in respect of product recall. I intend to go to an extract from that hearing, but it is more in the context of showing what the US government position was on AIDS at that time, rather than specifically about this issue of product recall, because although it was a debate that was happening amongst those who were closely involved in the topic, it doesn't seem to have been a major focus of the congressional hearing. I can take you to that document now, sir, or I know the time you may wish to leave until the morning.
Well, I think we're looking at the response to the pharmaceutical industry. I'm sorry. I don't know that unless it sheds some light on that. I'm particularly interested in what another government made of the situation.
So the quotation is paragraph 163 of the written presentation. People can look through it and decide if it's going to or not.
Well, it may be that it was picked up by the DHSS here, given that Dr. Fowler was speaking about it. So perhaps we'd better have it, because it might have informed debate.
We do know from a minute, and the reference is at 164, that Dr. Fowler was informed about the congressional hearing. Unfortunately, the minute in which Dr. Fowler comments upon the congressional hearing is one that we haven't been able to identify. So we know there was one, but we don't know what it said.
So we know that at least it was part of the material which fed into the debate in the UK.
Yes. Yes.
Well, in that case, shall we deal with it tomorrow morning?
Yes.
So 10 o'clock then tomorrow.